What's up guys, and in today's video I'm going to be going through why strategic solitude is my unfair advantage, how I'm actively thinking about this, and how I am using this as leverage to build Killer Chaos OS into the future, and also reshape how I'm taking a step back and also ultimately building to 10x the output that we have into the future. So like always with these videos, the main mission is to show our builds raw and real, to show you the good, the bad, the ugly, what it is that I'm actively implementing in terms of mental models, so that we can scale those mental models into the future and also just ultimately just build better products in terms of Killer Chaos OS, and also just to solve what hurts within businesses and organizations, to come in and ultimately be the chief problem solvers and build back-end infrastructure while we're at it, and also just to call in visionaries, basically people aligned with the mission of what it is that we're trying to solve for, which is killing chaos in the name, Killer Chaos OS, and also just building a network of cool people doing cool things at the same time. So this one's a super fun one. I think it's very important, in different stages. You get different phases, and this one is one of the ones that I like to think about in terms of taking a step back and just thinking a lot more. And this particular one is super important because the deeper I think, the sharper I build. So this is just in terms of Killer Chaos OS, because Killer Chaos OS isn't coming from dopamine loops, it's being shaped in silence, and that silence is where others fill their minds with stimulation. I subtract. I basically say, hey, how can I actively reflect on what it is that we're building for Killer Chaos OS in terms of how we're thinking about mental models, how we're thinking about implementations, and also ultimately just saying, hey, how can we use this time in this phase to ultimately think a lot deeper, that will ultimately allow us to 10x our output into the future, because we're ultimately just taking a stand of saying, hey, let's think a lot deeper now so that we can ultimately just also make sure that we're multiplying what we're doing. And that silence also removes a lot of noise that we ultimately need in order to build Killer Chaos OS. Because in certain times, at least I found that when you experience a lot of noise, or you hear a lot of voices from external people and things going on, I mean, there's so much information going on in this day and age, and that kind of clouds your judgment. And just being able to take a step back and build that clarity, that mental fortitude, that ultimately just allows you to say, hey, let's focus on what is true, what is aligned with what it is that we're actively solving for, so that once we understand this, then we can reason up from there. And that's why solitude isn't isolation, it's basically alignment. And this alignment is with what's true, what's useful, and what's next. Basically asking those questions of what is true, taking a step back from, we want to, understand what is going on. There are all these different things, AI is popping up and all these different things, but how can we actively just think a lot deeper by taking a step back and asking what is true, what actually makes sense, and what is, what can we actively get from first principles that we can reason up from there, and what's useful, what is going to be useful today, and what's going to be useful into the future. And this is super important, especially, the way I like to think about Killer Chaos OS is that chaos is going to be everywhere in business infrastructure and also into the future. And I'm super bullish on this to say, hey, one thing that is going to be a universal truth throughout business cycles is ultimately chaos. That systems and backend infrastructure is definitely going to be needed. Even with the new rise of AI, I think it's only just going to multiply in terms of how it's going to be used, and those different use cases are also just going to redefine what is useful. And by solely just understanding that, we can then ask what is next, we can then create what is next. But this clarity of just asking these questions simply, I believe, comes through just taking a step back and thinking a lot deeper, and taking a step back from all the noise that you hear and all these things, because that ultimately just turns you into a sharper builder and a sharper operator. And this is how I'm actively thinking about this, to say, hey, how can we actively take a step back to just just build this solitude that ultimately allows us to then say, hey, we're building this, and ultimately into the future we understand that we are taking taking this time to really understand what's true, what's useful, and what is going to be next, what is going to be the next evolution for, chaos killing. And we're just ultimately just asking those questions. I know it's going to bring a level of alignment that we wouldn't have had if we didn't take the step back and thinking a lot deeper and saying, hey, this isn't about escaping work, it's about engineering momentum through internal clarity. I think one of the most important things, at least I found for myself as well, is just ultimately just saying, hey, how can I have the most mental clarity, internal clarity that ultimately allows me to push what it is that we're doing? Because without clarity, you also ultimately just don't know what you're building. And I think clarity in each and every single sense, in terms of decision making, in terms of what we're building into the future, is going to play a key role in how we're going to structure and build Killer Chaos OS into the future. Not only that, but also into our personal lives, to say, hey, how can we build that internal clarity? And by simply taking a step back and just ignoring the noise and just focusing on what is true, what actually is going to be useful, and what is going to be next, just by simply asking those three things, we can ultimately then build a mental fortitude, or that mental clarity within our minds, that ultimately allows us to then say, hey, we understand what is true, what's going to be useful in the next 5-10 years, and then we're also ultimately just going to be able to build a blueprint of what is next. Because before, I like to think about it, is before, all these big companies, Apple and all these people, they didn't have that. They didn't have all this AI talk, and they didn't have all these chat GPTs and all these things, SpaceX and all these things, but they had what they had, which I believe to be, that internal mental clarity. And through that mental clarity, they were able to, build the Teslas, the SpaceX, the chat GPT, all these different things. And I think, that is a timeless principle that also ultimately we can just, steal like an artist from, to just take that nugget and say, hey, if they didn't have that at that time, what's to say that this is not timeless? And how can we actively build through learning from this, or through using this? Because I believe this is going to be this is going to be timeless, and ultimately understanding that, hey, during that time, they didn't know what they were doing. They didn't feel like they know that they knew what they were doing. And we also, shouldn't feel bad that we also don't, sometimes don't feel like we always know what we're doing. But the most important thing is just figuring out, just walking through the fire and just actively just figuring it out, and understanding that, hey, they took a step back, from at least my understanding, that they took a step back to really ask what is true, how is the future going to be built, and through that they built the mental clarity that then allowed them to reshape industries and transform what it is that they've been able to transform in their respective industries. And I think there's so many nuggets to take from that, and ultimately asking how can we actively just take from that as well, and also implement it in terms of what we're doing in terms of building back-end infrastructure as well, is going to play a vital role into the future. I'm super bullish on this, and I super am super obsessed about this, to say, hey, this is how I'm actively thinking about this. We could be wrong into the future, but I believe right now, in this point in time, in this phase, that is the source of truth that we're going to be seeking from, and also ultimately getting inspiration from, which ultimately leads to silence as a strategy, and saying, hey, noise leads to copy paste thinking. Also ultimately saying, hey, if we just listen to noise all the time, we're actively just going to be building what everyone else is building. But how do you truly redefine industries? How do you truly change the landscape of what you believe to be true? And I think this only comes through silence, and using that as your mode for originality. How can you create this authentic future that you believe to be true? And I think this comes from silence, which ultimately allows you to tune out the noise, and also understand what is true, what is going to be useful, and what is going to be next in the respective industry that we're going to be building for, which I think is going to be a moat that's going to reveal so many truths for us. I mean, into the future, I think the way that we're thinking about things, the way that we're going to be structuring things, is going to be very vital, because we're going to learn a lot of mistakes that we're going to make, and through those mistakes we're ultimately going to be able to build better into the future. And saying, hey, it's the quiet moments that I've trimmed fat off my systems through just solely just taking a step back and understanding understanding that, hey, I've actively, just taken a step back to think and get that mental clarity that ultimately allowed us to shave some fat off of the current systems that we've been building, and saying, hey, we've ultimately gotten this clarity by simply just, asking what is true from first principles. Do we actually need this step? Delete, 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 and then adding back what we need to add back. And I think, through this, that we've only been able to achieve this just by taking a step back and solely just asking those questions, those deep, meaningful questions. I think ultimately just reveal the truths that you wouldn't have had if you just did not ask the right questions as well. And then saying, hey, identified friction that we've been ignoring. Also ultimately asking, hey, what are the things that we believe to be true, or what are the things that we haven't been taking into consideration but have allowed us to then ignore it for a specific point in time, but that process of ignoring it ultimately was not yielding the best result into the future. And basically just asking those questions, I think we can just build a source of truth and use this strategy to ultimately just allow us to build better products into the future. And saying, hey, and rewritten flawed mental models with that outside bias, ultimately saying, hey, this outside bias that I had, I was able to then just rewrite the mental models that we use. And I think these videos are going to be super useful into the future in terms of how we're going to be building out, because we're going to get some things wrong in terms of mental models or the way that we've been thinking about things, but ultimately just by this 100 videos that we're going to be doing is going to equal to 100 new insights, which is ultimately going to equal to one refined machine, or one refined self, which is me. And ultimately that is unmatched. That level of leverage can never be matched, in my opinion, at this current point in time. And I think this is going to be such a huge ROI into the future. And I know that into the future we're only just going to use this to build better mental models, but through Solitude. And through this, we basically are able to create a competitive advantage through the clarity that we do gain from this. And saying, hey, clarity is earned when no one is watching. How can we build this source or this moat of internal clarity when no one is watching? Because that is where our ultimate leverage is going to lie. But ultimately with that is where friction hides and Solitude reveals. How can you basically just understand where is the friction within your current process? And this is where Solitude basically reveals that friction. And through this, I've at least found that, hey, taking a step back and asking the questions, or just asking better questions of what is true, do we actually need these specific steps in terms of this process, and how can we delete to make it as frictionless as possible? Ultimately just taking a step back and not listening to too many voices and just listening to your gut as well, but also implementing data through that is going to be super important. And I've found so many truths or things that I thought to be true at the time to be completely wrong, and that is okay. But now just taking a step back, I think reveals a lot of things, because it's easy to think when you're just in it that what you're seeing in front of you is true, but sometimes it's ultimately not. And how can you actively just take a step back and ultimately refine your process and just think things through, I think is the source of moat that we're going to actively just be using into the future, which has helped so far, but I know into the future we can just 10x it. And saying, hey, in the stillness, the real bottlenecks rise to the surface, ultimately just understanding that, hey, the friction points that we may be facing today ultimately are going to arise from us taking a step back and gaining that internal clarity that ultimately allows us to refine the machine. And saying, hey, the ones that don't scream, they but silently slow you down, ultimately saying, hey, what are the bottlenecks that are ultimately slowing you down that you don't actively see on a day-to-day basis? Is it your process? Is it your workflows? What are the things that are actively slowing you down that don't scream, and how can you solve for that? And I also like to say, hey, you only move as fast as your constraints. So ultimately saying, hey, your bottlenecks and your constraints, what holds you back, your business is actively moving as fast as those things. So how can you actively solve for them and actively move a lot faster, I think is the question that ultimately allows you to then to understand that, hey, you need to solve for this bottleneck ASAP in order to move faster, because that that constraint is holding you back. And ultimately understanding that, hey, a hesitation in a pitch, a half-believed offer, a bloated system you've been too busy to notice, the silence that gives it a voice, and saying, hey, and when you listen, you ultimately build with ruthless efficiency. I think efficiency at scale is going to be the moats that is ultimately just going to allow us to build Chaos OS, and just ultimately just refining the machine, but ultimately understanding that, hey, we need to understand where the friction points are, but in order to do that, we need to also be able to take a step back and also just fully understand that, hey, Solitude is also just going to create that mental clarity, and what are the strategies that we're going to have in terms of building that solitude, that space where we can build that internal clarity that allows us to then see the road path forward and also just remove the friction, which ultimately needs to be, tied with the vision. And vision crystallizes alone through that, and saying, hey, everyone wants to talk about vision, but most haven't felt it in their bones, and it simply does not happen in meetings. It happens in the silence before meetings. And solely just understanding that, hey, the silence that ultimately brings, this vision and internal clarity doesn't come through meetings, doesn't come from me telling you that, hey, this vision, this is the vision and XYZ. It comes from, hey, before the meeting, let's have everything to be quiet. Let's quiet, or let's have solitude, and ultimately ask the questions of what is true now and how can I shape the future, and ultimately just asking those questions then brings that vision. And through that, you can say, hey, it happens in the silence before the meetings, and what question have I sat with that has ultimately helped me in this as well, which is, what does Killer Chaos OS look like when it is inevitable? Simply by asking this question, it also brings a different source, different variables into play to say, hey, what if Killer Chaos OS was inevitable? How would it look like? How would we build it out? If this were to be true, if this end goal were to be true, how should we move towards that today and build those, those compounding efforts in order to build that future? And simply just asking those questions, I think, brings so much, clarity in terms of vision, that ultimately allows you to see the roadmap to say, hey, this is the ultimate end goal, and this is how we're building it today, and these are the compounding steps that we need to take in order to reach that big picture vision. But through that, it's not what looks good online, but what worked when scaled. What works when scaled? And ultimately asking that question answered alone gave me the clearest roadmap yet to say, hey, asking this question of what does Killer Chaos OS look like when it is inevitable ultimately allows us to build everything else, or the foundation around what we're doing today, into the future. And solely through that, we are ultimately able to move as fast as we possibly can through speed, because with speed comes the stillness. And through that, most people sprint in cycles. I slow down with intent so I can accelerate my direction to say, hey, I need to make sure that I'm slowing down, but this isn't monk mode, it's precision mode. How can I be as precise as I possibly can by simply just slowing down and using the stillness to ultimately scale and move fast in a sense? It's inversion thinking to say, hey, how can I actively just move slow in order to move fast? By asking the questions of, hey, what is the processes, or what things can I use to move as slow as I can internally, so that externally I can then use that to move faster externally. And saying, hey, every insight born from silence becomes leverage. Ultimately just saying, hey, every insight that I've gained when I've just had stillness and quiet and just thought in my mind, that ultimately becomes leverage that I can compound into the future. And saying, hey, every refined decision compounds into momentum. How can we then use these decisions and then use that to compound into momentum that ultimately fuels Killer Chaos OS, or what it is that we're building at the time? And saying, hey, this is how I build fast, by thinking slow, thinking a lot slower, but ultimately moving a lot faster externally. Ultimately, I think, is the source of moat, or the source of truth that we're going to be using into the future, that ultimately brings us that internal clarity, that ultimately allows us to scale what it is that we're building, and also just solve problems at a scale that we are going to be doing into the future. And how I'm doing this right now is doing 30 minutes of solid blocks every morning, no phone, no inputs, so nothing at all, just ultimately thinking what would the future look like if this was inevitable, and then how can I build around that, and saying, hey, a daily notion of clarity logs, one question, one answer. What is the one question that I can possibly ask, and what is the one answer that I can have to build that internal clarity in terms of the things that I'm actively needing to solve that day, and saying, hey, questioning which parts of my work are noise versus signal, basically identifying what is noise within, my mental space, what are the things that, are constituting to noise, and what are the things that are constituting to signal. That signal to noise ratio, how does it look like, and how can I actively, improve to say, hey, I want to focus more on signal, or increase signal and decrease noise. How can I actively focus on that? And asking those questions each and every single morning, I think, bring that internal clarity that allows us to then ask, how can we build into the future, and how can we actively, just create as much value as we possibly can. Because with noise, you are ultimately not able to clearly picture how the future should be. And ultimately, this is just my personal belief that, hey, in as much as you can, have so much noise within your mind space, ultimately that noise is not going to benefit you long term unless it's replaced with signal. And through that signal, how can you create the most amount of signal in your mental space through clarity? I think asking those questions ultimately is going to refine our process into the future. And then saying, hey, I'm rewriting Killer Chaos OS from zero, no tools, no ego. Ultimately just saying, hey, how can I actively rewrite Killer Chaos OS from scratch, and ultimately build it from the ground up, and say, hey, this is how I think Killer Chaos OS should look like into the future, which ultimately is going to be the roadmap that we're kind of going to be using and thinking about. And this is super important. And I just, built a final thought just to ultimately end this off with, which is the most valuable rooms in the world are quiet. So I'm practicing being one of them. So the most valuable rooms in the world, I believe to be the most quiet, and that's because builders who think clearly build powerful, and through clarity, not cash. That is the rarest asset in the early game. And I think building that mental clarity is going to be one of our unfair advantages that we're going to have into the future. We may be super wrong on this, but ultimately just, just being able to think and build this mental clarity through timeless, principles. I think this is going to be the moat that is going to, possibly, change the trajectory of Killer Chaos OS. And I'm super excited to, just keep on constantly just redefining how we're thinking, because I think right now, our biggest assets is the way that we're thinking, and also, just building things. And I think into the future, we're just only going to be able to scale our thinking and also our output, but through these daily videos. And these daily videos are building the moat that ultimately refines our thinking and how we're actively solving problems that ultimately build the future of Killer Chaos OS, of us just redefining industries, also inspiring millions of people, and having $100 million worth of impact someday. And ultimately through that, I know we're going to get there. It's just a question of how can we build those, compounding steps today that ultimately build that momentum, that snowball into the big picture vision that we have into the future. So this was super fun. I think this one is going to be one of the ones for the history books into the future that we're going to just revisit a lot, and just, take a lot of inspiration and nuggets from, and also just ultimately build that compounding leverage through clarity. I think this video is going to be super, valuable to that, and I'm super excited to just constantly just keep hitting the needle, keep hitting the nail in the wall, and just constantly just refining Killer Chaos OS, and just actively just building each and every single day. If you guys enjoyed this video, make sure to connect with me on X, LinkedIn, Instagram, and I will see you guys in the next video.